The new iPhone 14 and iPhone 14 Pro are here, and with four models at very close price points, with only $100 separating each model, and with the normal phones and Pro phones being the exact same sizes, the decision on what phone you should buy this year might actually be more confusing than ever. Thankfully, you stumbled onto this video, and I'm gonna walk you through not only what iPhone 14 you should buy, but also the differences between all of these models, and also some mistakes that you should avoid to ensure that you get the best iPhone model. Alright, the first thing that you can't be fooled by is battery life. This is such an important feature, it's why I put it right up front, because this is a very important deciding factor when buying a new phone, and I need to explain to you how confusing the battery life ratings for these new phones are, because if you looked at the website on Apple's official tech specs, you would assume that the normal iPhone 14 and iPhone 14 Plus have worse battery life than their immediate counterparts, the iPhone 14 Pro and iPhone 14 Pro Max. And that isn't 100% accurate. So listen, will some or maybe even most users see better battery life by opting for the Pro model on each phone? Probably because the iPhone 14 Pro and the Pro Max both use a display that can lower the refresh rate all the way down to 1 Hz, and this adaptive refresh rate can actually save you on battery life, especially when you're watching video, and that's because the refresh rate for video is usually 30 or 24 frames per second. That's why if you look at the video rating battery life for all of these models, the iPhone 14 Pro wins out. However, take a look at the audio playback rating. This is actually quite interesting. So if you had the display off and just ran music in the background, the iPhone 14 has better battery life than the iPhone 14 Pro, and the iPhone 14 Plus has better battery life than the iPhone 14 Pro Max. So don't be fooled into thinking the iPhone 14 Pro Max has the best battery life by default, because it really depends on how you use these devices. So if you don't watch a ton of video on your new iPhone, it's possible you could have better battery life by going for the iPhone 14 Plus than the iPhone 14 Pro Max model. Another thing you really can't be fooled by is thinking that the upgrades to each of these models this year are similar. There are a lot of differences between the normal iPhone 14 and the iPhone 14 Pro phones, and there's a few areas to really look out for. I think the biggest thing people will be confused by is the display. Because at a glance, the iPhone 14 models have the same 6.1 and 6.7 inch display sizes as the Pro models this year, so you might not think there's a big difference picking one over the other, but as you probably know, that's not the case. The iPhone 14 display lacks a number of improvements. First of all, it is significantly less bright in daylight use, getting up to 800 nits of screen brightness, while the Pro models can go all the way up to an insane 2000 nits of max brightness when using it in direct sunlight, which just sounds like you'll never have a problem seeing these displays ever again. I can't picture like having 2000 nits of brightness on the phone and having glare. I can't wait to actually see what that looks like. And like last year, the Pro models also have a faster 120 Hz refresh rate, so animations, scrolling, and just the way things respond will look smoother on the Pro models compared to the normal models. Furthermore, because of the lower 1 Hz refresh rate capabilities, on these new displays, the iPhone 14 Pro models are the only new iPhones to have an always-on display, which will kind of just dim your lock screen and can run at 1 Hz, which means you can still see your lock screen widgets, the time, the live activities, and even your wallpaper. And that's probably one of the best looking always-on displays I have ever seen. Another thing with these size differences, though, is there is a big weight difference between these models, despite them having the same size. So if you want a light phone, pay attention. So the iPhone 14 and the iPhone 14 Plus are made with aluminum sides, while the 14 Pro and Pro Max have stainless steel sides, and stainless steel is heavier than aluminum. So the iPhone 14 weighs 172 grams, while the Pro weighs 203 grams. And the Pro Max is the heaviest, weighing a whopping 240 grams. Actually, if you look at the iPhone 14 Plus, the 6.7-inch sized normal iPhone, it is the lightest big 6.5 or 6.7-inch size iPhone ever, weighing in at 203 grams. In fact, that's even 3 grams lighter than the regular 6.1-inch iPhone 14 Pro. So that iPhone 14 Plus model might actually feel really great to hold, and I personally find the Pro iPhone models just a tad bit too heavy, so hey, if you're like me, or if that's like a big concern for you, you might actually want to pick up that Plus model. I feel like that's gonna it's gonna be a nice phone to actually just pick up and hold if you want a big display. Okay, another obvious difference is the design themselves, right? The 14 is retaining the same exact front design as the iPhone 13, while the iPhone 14 Pro gets a new pill-shaped camera cutout, complete with a new software feature called the Dynamic Island. I did a video on this the other day talking about my thoughts on this new Dynamic Island concept, so if you want to learn more, click up here. But yeah, I think basically this is really cool. I love how it basically gives you another user interface that cleverly hides the cutout and makes it part of the actual user interface. And listen, I know a lot of people are going to just look at the design and think it's just an aesthetic choice, but don't be fooled by that either. This might actually change the way that you use your iPhone because you can control apps from this dynamic island and even switch between some recent apps or see useful information like timers. And there's a lot of cool features with the dynamic island. It's more than just shrinking the size of the cutout. It's almost, and bear with me here, it's almost kind of like having a very small sliver of multitasking on the iPhone with its own separate, smaller user interface. And honestly, it seems like a pretty ingenious concept. Perhaps the most notable difference between these phones, though, is actually the camera system. Both phones have vastly different camera systems this year. So the iPhone 14 is basically getting the iPhone 13 Pro's 12 megapixel main camera system from last year. Now, obviously, it doesn't have the telephoto lens, but also be made aware that the ultra wide angle lens isn't from the 13 Pro too. It was kind of confusing because it almost made it seem like they framed it like it was like exactly the 13 Pro's camera system, but it does not have autofocus on the ultra wide angle camera, meaning it cannot use the macro mode photography feature on the normal iPhone 14. So the 13 Pro, even though they're kind of using the same sensor as the 13 Pro, I should say, the 14 still loses out on a lot of features that made this 13 Pro camera system pretty versatile. Another thing you have to really note here is that the Pro models, the iPhone 14 Pro, they get the true upgrade. They get a new 48 megapixel sensor, which can actually utilize the full 48 megapixel sensor when shooting with the new Pro RAW format, and it also gets a new ultra wide camera and just a lot of other improvements to the camera system. So don't think the camera systems are similar. The rear systems are very different this year, and there is a big advantage, it looks like, for the iPhone 14 Pro. Listen, if you are leaning towards the iPhone 14 Pro for that massive camera upgrade, which, let's be honest, you probably are, here are some areas you need to look out for. First of all, don't skimp on storage. 128 gigabytes is fine for a regular user, but if you're planning to utilize features like 4K ProRes video recording or using the Pro RAW camera feature to take 48 megapixel photos, that is just going to chew through your storage insanely fast, and your 128 gigabytes will go through like that, like in a snap, it will be gone. So I highly recommend the minimum storage options you get for the Pro model is 256 gigabytes of storage. And honestly, I think this year, with all the new camera features, 512 gigabytes of storage is the safe option here. I feel like that is the option I am personally going for. I am definitely bumping up my storage this year, and I am saying that as someone that usually goes for a 256 gigabyte model. These phones are going to eat through storage if you use those Pro camera features. Now, even though we just talked about the big camera improvements on the Pro models, don't be fooled into thinking the iPhone 14 doesn't have any camera improvements. There are noticeable camera improvements that even the iPhone 13 Pro did not have. One of those is the new action mode, which lets your iPhone footage be super stable and not shaky, even without the use of a dedicated stabilizer like a gimbal. This will work by stabilizing 4K footage and bringing that down to 2.8K resolution. Furthermore, the regular iPhone 14 also gets access to the new 4K cinematic mode. This was presented as an exclusive iPhone 14 Pro feature, but don't be fooled. If you go on Apple's website, you can see that this 4K cinematic mode is also making its way to the iPhone 14 and will support 24 or 30 frames per second in 4K. The biggest improvement to the 14 camera, though, is actually the front-facing camera, which will actually be the same as the Pro's front-facing camera. So it's going to have a new 12 megapixel sensor with a bigger f1.9 aperture that lets in more light, and for the first time ever, which I kind of really didn't even realize, the front-facing camera on the iPhone is going to have autofocus. It kind of blows my mind that I didn't realize it didn't have autofocus before, but yeah, I was like looking at my phone, I'm like, oh yeah, It doesn't autofocus, it's a fixed focus camera. So autofocus on the front-facing camera. These are really nice improvements for the front-facing camera this year. One more quick thing to note about the camera system is that the iPhone 14 Pro is actually using a different focal length for the main camera. It's a wider 24mm focal length, which means it will, it'll be a wider shot, while the iPhone 14 sticks with a more zoomed in 26mm focal length, giving you a slightly tighter shot. This also means that the new software 2x camera mode on the iPhone 14 Pro will actually be a 48mm equivalent rather than the 50mm focal length of the old native 2x camera. So even though they kind of market it like, oh, it's a return to the old 2x camera, there's going to be a slight perspective difference. Whether or not that's a big difference, I feel like probably not. You'd probably have to nitpick it. Okay, a big thing you need to realize, you really need to realize this, is that the new iPhones will be the first ever without a physical SIM card tray, or just a physical SIM card, I guess. Well, at least in North America. And it will now rely entirely on eSIM. So if you're someone that travels and maybe you're used to getting like a physical SIM card in other countries, you're going to need to make sure that you have a cellular carrier that either has good international rates, or be prepared to have a second eSIM activate when you're traveling. You're gonna have to learn through that entire process. So maybe we can cover that in a future review video when that comes out. Okay, one really noticeable difference this year is that this is the first iPhone ever released, which basically has the same chip as the previous year. Yes, the iPhone 14 still uses the A15 chip with 5 GPU cores. Now, this is the same chip that was in the iPhone 13 Pro, and while it will still have the extra GPU performance from this 13 Pro, in general, for most activities that people use it for, it will basically operate the same as the iPhone 13 did last year. And that's just a way to say you probably won't notice any speed improvements if you're coming from an iPhone 13. Now, the iPhone 14 Pro model is the only one with a noticeable speed improvement this year, and it's the only model to get the new A16 chip. And the A16 chip is built on a new 4nm process, which has a faster 6-core CPU, and the GPU has an additional 50% memory bandwidth. So yeah, this is actually the first year that the Pro iPhones will perform better in CPU and GPU performance. All right, the last mistake not to make is don't forget about the iPhone 13. Aha! Yes, Apple kept the iPhone 13 and my beloved iPhone 13 mini still in the lineup, and they dropped the prices by $100 each for both of those models. Like we kind of talked about in this video, the iPhone 14, the normal version, it's an upgrade, but in some areas, it kind of seems like a side grade. It has some of the same features that the iPhone 13 had, and it doesn't get a lot of the noticeable improvements that the Pro models had. So maybe the best option for a lot of the people watching this video is to just get a normal iPhone 13 model. Or hey, if these phones look gigantic to you and you were planning on getting an iPhone mini this year and you're kind of shocked they dropped it from the lineup, well, hey, now you can save $100, get the iPhone 13 mini, and that is still a great phone. So yeah, you might want to actually not consider getting any iPhone 14 this year and still go for what appears to be still a great phone, the iPhone 13. Now, another thing you can't be fooled by is the release dates for these products. This is very, very, very important if you want to get an iPhone on day one and you want to get a new model as quickly as possible. So for the iPhone 14, 14 Plus, 14 Pro, and 14 Pro Max, they are literally going up for pre-order in less than a day if you just watch this video like as soon as it was uploaded. So make sure you set your alarm for 5 a.m. Pacific time or 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time to get a pre-order in. And then the release date for these phones will be the following Friday, September 16th. However, don't be fooled by the iPhone 14 Plus, because even though you can pre-order it tomorrow, it will be shipping out later than the other phones and won't be available until Friday, October 7th. Honestly, if I had to wait for that phone, that might shift my purchasing decision to the Pro Max, because I don't like to wait for technology. I get way too I don't have enough patience. I just don't have enough patience for it. As for what phone you should order, it depends. Listen, I think this year it's all about the Pro phones. They get the most new features, have the new design, the new cool dynamic island, and they did not get a price increase this year. So for a $200 difference between the iPhone 14 and the iPhone 14 Pro, I feel like this is a year where the price difference really adds up, and it seems well worth it to go for the Pro model. I think the iPhone 14 Plus might be the hardest sell of all personally for me this year. $900 is almost pro pricing territory, but I can understand that for some people, the camera features or the new design or maybe the increased weight of the iPhone 14 Pro phone just doesn't make it $200 more appealing. And yeah, if you don't care about the bigger resolution of the 48 megapixel camera or an always on display, $200 is a decent chunk of money, especially if you just want a big screen phone. That's how you're gonna save $200 compared to the Pro Max model. And while expensive, the iPhone 14 Plus also gets a lot of benefits that people love, right? It does get that big display, and it does get the best battery life on maybe any iPhone. And it might be enough reason to pick that over the $1,099 iPhone 14 Pro Max. And because you won't have features like the 48 megapixel sensor, the base 128 gigabytes of storage is fine for almost anyone. However, if you want my real personal hot take, I say go Pro or go home. Seriously, the iPhone 14 Pro or Pro Max looks like the phone to get this year, and I'm personally planning on ordering either a 512 gigabyte iPhone 14 Pro or a Pro Max. So maybe let me know in the comments which one should I order. But yeah, enough about me. Let me hear from you in the comments below. What iPhone are you planning on buying? And also, let me know, did you find this video helpful in deciding between an iPhone 14 or an iPhone 14 Pro? And if it was, be sure to leave me a like and subscribe to see my full review when I get these phones. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.